Ethan Harris had always imagined his move to Ridgehaven as the beginning of a new chapter. Nestled among tree-lined streets and meticulously landscaped lawns, the suburban neighborhood promised stability and serenity, two things he desperately needed after the past 2 turbulent years. A talented software developer and a widowed father to his 14-year-old daughter, Lily, Ethan saw their new home as more than just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could finally find some peace and rebuild their lives. The house itself was charming, a 2-story craftsman with white shutters, a wide porch, and a backyard that Lily immediately fell in love with. As they unpacked boxes and set up their new life, Ethan felt a growing sense of accomplishment. For once, things seemed to be falling into place. Lily, though still carrying the weight of losing her mother, appeared happier, spending afternoons in the backyard with her sketchbook, drawing trees and birds. Ethan even found himself relaxing, letting go of the relentless guilt and exhaustion that had consumed him since his wife's passing. The first week in Ridgehaven passed uneventfully, but Ethan quickly realized that life in the neighborhood was far from typical. On their second evening, he received a crisp white envelope marked with the Ridgehaven Homeowners Association (HOA) logo. Inside was a warm welcome letter signed by Neil Bradley, the HOA president. The letter outlined the association's rules and emphasized their commitment to maintaining the pristine aesthetic and harmonious community spirit of Ridgehaven. Ethan found the language overly formal, but he dismissed it as standard bureaucracy. Along with the letter came an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue that weekend, organized by the HOA to help newcomers feel at home. Ethan decided to attend, hoping to meet some of the neighbors and make connections. The barbecue, held in the backyard of a sprawling colonial-style house, initially felt welcoming. There were strings of lights draped across trees, tables laden with food, and children running around with popsicles. Neil Bradley was the first to greet Ethan, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a firm handshake and an unnervingly piercing gaze. Dressed impeccably in khakis and a polo shirt, he exuded authority and charisma. "Ethan, welcome to Ridgehaven," Neil said, his voice smooth but commanding. "We pride ourselves on keeping this neighborhood in tip-top shape. You'll find things run very efficiently around here as long as everyone follows the rules." Ethan nodded politely, sensing the undertone in Neil's words but choosing not to read too much into it. As the evening progressed, Ethan began noticing subtle dynamics among the neighbors. Conversations often turned to discussions about lawn care, house paint colors, and other seemingly trivial topics that the HOA apparently took very seriously. Neil seemed to be at the center of every interaction, offering unsolicited advice and occasionally making pointed comments about homeowners who had failed to comply with regulations. At one point, he openly criticized the choice of flowers in a nearby garden, chuckling as the group around him laughed nervously. Ethan noticed how people avoided disagreeing with Neil, their smiles tight and forced. After the barbecue, Ethan couldn't shake a peculiar feeling about Neil and the HOA. While the other neighbors had been polite and friendly on the surface, there was an underlying tension he couldn't quite put his finger on. Lily, perceptive as always, asked him on the drive home, "Dad, do you think people here are scared of that Neil guy?" Ethan shrugged it off, assuring her that Neil was just one of those people who liked to be in charge. Over the next few days, Ethan tried to focus on work and settling into the new routine. He was busy arranging Lily's school schedule, setting up his home office, and tackling minor home repairs. But the presence of the HOA lingered in the background, subtle but persistent. On their third day in the neighborhood, Neil appeared unannounced at their doorstep. "Just checking in," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything going smoothly? If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." The visit seemed harmless enough, but Ethan couldn't help but feel it was more of an inspection than a friendly check-in. Neil's gaze lingered on their front yard, his smile tightening when he noticed a slightly tilted mailbox. A few evenings later, while Ethan was weeding the flower beds, his next-door neighbor, Margaret Sloan, approached him cautiously. An elderly widow with kind eyes, Margaret had been one of the few people at the barbecue who seemed genuinely warm and welcoming. "Ethan, I hope you don't mind me saying this," she began hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder, "but just be careful with the HOA. Neil Bradley, He doesn't like people who don't fall in line. My late husband had a run-in with him over our rose bushes, and well, let's just say it didn't end well. She didn't elaborate, but her tone carried a warning that Ethan couldn't ignore. Ethan brushed off Margaret's concerns, convincing himself that she was being overly cautious. He had no intention of causing trouble. But as the days passed, he began to notice more peculiarities. A neighbor across the street received a notice for leaving their trash cans out a few hours too long, and another was fined for having a basketball hoop in their driveway. It all seemed excessive, but Ethan figured it didn't concern him. He and Lily were keeping to themselves and abiding by the rules. There was no reason for the HOA to single them out. Or so he thought. A week after the barbecue, Ethan felt like he was finally settling into life in Ridgehaven. Lily seemed happy, and the house was starting to feel like home. He was in his office working on a project when the doorbell rang. Expecting a package, he opened the door to find a man in a gray uniform holding a clipboard. The man handed him a sealed envelope stamped with the Ridgehaven HOA logo, then left without saying a word. Confused, Ethan opened the envelope and read the letter inside. His confusion quickly turned to disbelief. The letter informed him that he had been fined $500 for unauthorized modifications to his mailbox. According to the HOA, the color and angle of his mailbox did not meet Ridgehaven's strict aesthetic guidelines. Ethan stared at the letter, dumbfounded. The mailbox had come with the house. It wasn't something he had even thought about changing. The letter warned that failure to pay the fine within 14 days would result in additional penalties. There was no explanation for the fine beyond the vague language in the letter. Annoyed but determined to sort it out, Ethan decided to contact the HOA directly. He found the phone number on the letter and called the office. After being placed on hold for nearly 10 minutes, he was finally connected to a woman who identified herself as Denise, the HOA administrator. Her tone was curt and disinterested as Ethan explained the situation. "There must be some kind of mistake," he said. "I haven't touched the mailbox since I moved in." Denise didn't seem moved. "The violation was noted during a routine inspection," she replied. "The mailbox does not meet HOA standards. If you'd like to appeal the fine, you can submit a formal request, but I should warn you that appeals are rarely successful." "What exactly is wrong with the mailbox?" Ethan asked, struggling to keep his frustration in check. Denise sighed. "It's painted a non-compliant color, and it appears to be tilted approximately 3 degrees off center. Those are violations under the Ridgehaven HOA bylaws." Ethan was speechless for a moment. 3 degrees? You've got to be kidding me. This is absurd. "Sir," Denise interrupted, her voice firm, "the HOA takes compliance very seriously. If you refuse to pay the fine, the matter will be escalated." Ethan hung up, fuming. He couldn't believe the pettiness of the situation. A tilted mailbox? This was beyond ridiculous. Still, he decided to deal with it directly. That afternoon, he drove to the Ridgehaven HOA office, a small but intimidating building located in a nearby strip mall. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a frosty demeanor, barely glanced up from her computer as Ethan explained that he was there to discuss a fine. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked flatly. "No, but then you'll need to wait." She gestured to a row of chairs by the wall. After 20 minutes, Ethan was finally called into a small conference room where Neil Bradley was waiting for him. Neil greeted him with the same tight smile he had worn at the barbecue, gesturing for him to sit down. Ethan wasted no time. "Neil, this fine doesn't make any sense. The mailbox came with the house. I haven't changed it." Neil leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Ethan, I understand this may seem trivial to you, but the HOA's guidelines are what keep Ridgehaven beautiful and cohesive. The rules exist for a reason." "But this is unreasonable," Ethan countered. "How is a tilted mailbox worth a $500 fine?" Neil's smile didn't waver. "The fine isn't just for the mailbox. It's for the violation of our community standards. If we let small infractions slide, it sets a dangerous precedent. I'm sure you understand." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. "So you're saying I have no choice but to pay?" Neil's eyes glinted. "You always have a choice, Ethan. You can comply, or you can face the consequences." Something about the way Neil said it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He wanted to argue further, but he could see it was pointless. Neil wasn't going to budge. Furious but refusing to give in, Ethan left the office without agreeing to pay the fine. The following morning, Ethan woke to find something strange in his driveway. A large pile of construction debris, planks of wood, broken tiles, and chunks of concrete had been dumped directly behind his car, blocking it in. There was no note, no explanation. At first, Ethan assumed it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a construction crew had delivered materials to the wrong address. But as he inspected the pile, he noticed something odd. Several of the wooden planks were spray-painted with the Ridgehaven HOA logo. His heart sank. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. Ethan stormed back into the house and called the HOA office. Once again, he was placed on hold for an excruciating amount of time before Denise answered. "There's a pile of debris blocking my car," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "It has the HOA logo on it. What's going on?" Denise's tone was as indifferent as ever. "That debris is part of a landscaping project being conducted by the HOA. It will be removed once your outstanding fine is paid." Ethan was stunned. "Are you serious? You're using construction debris to block my driveway because of a mailbox fine?" Denise didn't even flinch. "The debris is temporary. As soon as the fine is resolved, it will be removed." Ethan's anger boiled over. "This is extortion. You can't do this." "Sir? I suggest you read the HOA bylaws," Denise replied coolly. "The Ridgehaven HOA reserves the right to take necessary measures to enforce compliance." Ethan hung up, shaking with rage. He felt trapped, powerless. Every interaction with the HOA seemed designed to wear him down, to make him feel small and helpless. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to back down. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle. If he gave in now, what would stop them from coming after him again? That evening, Ethan tried to talk to his neighbors, hoping to rally support or at least get advice. But when he brought up the HOA, most of them clammed up, clearly uncomfortable. "I wouldn't push it if I were you," one neighbor said cautiously. "Neil doesn't like being challenged. It's better to just pay the fine and move on." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was everyone in Ridgehaven so afraid of Neil Bradley? And what kind of power did he have to make an entire neighborhood submit to his will? As Ethan returned home that night, his frustration turned to determination. He wasn't going to let the HOA bully him into submission. He would find a way to fight back, no matter what it took. What he didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. The real battle was just getting started. Ethan spent the next day trying to clear his mind, but the pile of construction debris in his driveway loomed as a constant reminder of the HOA's blatant intimidation. He made several phone calls to local waste disposal services, hoping to get the debris removed, but when he explained that it was HOA property, most of them refused to get involved. The few who were willing quoted exorbitant prices, and Ethan realized the HOA had effectively trapped him. His car remained stuck in the garage, forcing him to work from home and ask his daughter, Lily, to carpool with a classmate to school. It was inconvenient and humiliating, but Ethan refused to let Neil Bradley and his HOA win. By midweek, Ethan decided he couldn't wait for the debris to magically disappear. He grabbed a pair of gloves and a shovel and began the painstaking process of clearing the driveway himself. The work was exhausting, and the sheer volume of debris made it clear that this would take days. As Ethan paused to catch his breath, he noticed something unusual. A black SUV parked across the street with tinted windows. It had been idling there since he started working, and although the driver never stepped out, Ethan could feel their gaze on him. When he stood and turned to face the vehicle, it slowly rolled away. A shiver ran down his spine. That evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table nursing sore muscles, Lily wandered in with a concerned look on her face. "Dad, are we okay?" she asked hesitantly, glancing at the papers and HOA notices scattered across the table. "It feels like I don't know, like this neighborhood is against us." Ethan sighed and reached out to squeeze her hand. "We're fine, sweetheart. It's just some bureaucratic nonsense. I'll handle it." "But what if they keep doing stuff like this?" she pressed. "What if it gets worse?" Ethan wanted to reassure her, but the truth was, he didn't know what Neil Bradley and his HOA were capable of. He decided to call Margaret Sloan, the elderly neighbor who had previously warned him about Neil. Margaret was hesitant to talk at first, but eventually invited Ethan over for tea, saying there was something he needed to know. The following afternoon, Ethan walked over to Margaret's modest home, a cozy single-story house filled with antiques and family photos. She ushered him into the living room and poured him a cup of tea before settling into a floral-patterned armchair. "Ethan," she began, her voice low, "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I can see you're in a bad spot. Neil Bradley has been running this HOA like a fiefdom for years. He gets away with it because most people are too scared to stand up to him." "Scared of what?" Ethan asked. "What can he really do?" Margaret gave him a grim smile. "More than you think. He doesn't just issue fines and dump trash in driveways. Neil has access to everyone's personal information, financial records, property deeds, even family details. He uses that information to pressure people. A few years ago, he targeted a young couple down the street, the Reynoldses. They were late on a small HOA payment, and Neil started sending them fines for every little thing: weeds in the yard, trash cans left out for an hour too long. When they tried to fight back, their house mysteriously went into foreclosure. They left Ridgehaven within months." Ethan frowned. "How is that even possible? The HOA can't just take someone's house." "Oh, but they can," Margaret said bitterly. "It's in the bylaws. If you fall behind on dues or fines, they can file a line on your property. And if you can't pay, they auction it off. Neil works with some real estate investors who buy the foreclosed properties dirt cheap. It's a racket, but proving it is another story." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? Margaret sighed. "Because he's careful. He knows how to toe the line between what's legal and what's outright fraud. And even when he crosses that line, most people don't have the resources to fight him. It's easier to pay the fines and stay in his good graces." Ethan left Margaret's house with a heavy heart. He couldn't believe how deep the corruption ran, but it also explained why his neighbors were so reluctant to get involved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Margaret hadn't told him. He decided to do some digging of his own. That night, Ethan stayed up late poring over the Ridgehaven HOA bylaws and local property laws. He discovered that the HOA had far more power than he'd realized. Their authority extended beyond issuing fines. They could initiate foreclosure proceedings for unpaid dues or violations, often with minimal notice. What's more, the bylaws allowed the HOA board to make unilateral decisions without consulting residents. It was a system designed to give people like Neil Bradley unchecked control. As Ethan read further, he stumbled across a clause that struck him as particularly suspicious. It mentioned a provision for emergency measures that allowed the HOA to take temporary actions to enforce compliance. The language was vague, but it seemed to justify things like the pile of debris in his driveway. Ethan realized this clause could be used to harass residents under the guise of maintaining community standards. The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to confront Neil directly. He marched into the HOA office, bypassing Denise at the front desk, and barged into Neil's office without knocking. Neil looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," he said calmly, "what can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why there's a pile of your trash blocking my car," Ethan snapped. Neil's smile never wavered. "I believe Denise explained the situation. The debris will be removed once your outstanding fine is paid." "This is harassment, and you know it," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You're using these rules to bully people into submission." Neil stood and walked around his desk, his posture relaxed but his tone menacing. "Harassment? No, Ethan, this is about accountability. Ridgehaven is a community of high standards, and we expect every resident to uphold those standards. If you refuse to comply, there are consequences. Like stealing people's homes?" Ethan shot back. "I know about the Reynoldses. I know how you've been running this HOA like your personal kingdom." Neil's eyes darkened. "Be very careful, Ethan. Accusations like that can have serious repercussions." Ethan took a step closer. "I'm not scared of you, Neil. You can't intimidate me." Neil's smile returned, but it was cold and predatory. "We'll see about that." Ethan left the office more determined than ever, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard a faint noise outside like footsteps crunching on gravel. He got up and looked out the window, but the street was empty. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, making it clear that Neil Bradley wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan woke up the next morning with a gnawing sense of unease. The confrontation with Neil Bradley had left him shaken, but more than that, it had confirmed what Margaret had said. Neil didn't just enforce HOA rules, he wielded them like weapons. Ethan's mind raced as he sipped his morning coffee, staring out at the debris still blocking his driveway. He knew he couldn't back down, but the scope of the fight ahead of him was daunting. How could he, a single father, take on a man with seemingly unlimited power and a system designed to protect him? Lily came downstairs, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She hesitated in the doorway, looking at her father. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ethan forced a smile and nodded, but she wasn't convinced. "I saw that black car again this morning," she added. "The one with the tinted windows. It was parked near the corner, just sitting there." Ethan's smile faltered. "Did you see who was inside?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "No," Lily said, shaking her head. "But it's weird, right?" Ethan didn't want to alarm her, but his concern deepened. Whoever was in that car wasn't just passing through, they were watching. He told Lily to be careful and asked her to let him know if she saw the car again. After she left for school, Ethan sat down at his desk, determined to take action. His first step was to gather evidence. He decided to document everything: the finds, the pile of debris, the black SUV, and every interaction with the HOA. If he was going to fight this, he needed proof. He spent hours photographing the debris from every angle, taking detailed notes, and organizing the HOA notices and bylaws into a folder. But even as he worked, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind: would any of this matter? Neil had manipulated the system for years. What made Ethan think he could beat him at his own game? Later that afternoon, Ethan received a surprise visitor. Margaret Sloane appeared on his doorstep, clutching a weathered envelope. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice low. "About fighting Neil. I don't know if it'll help, but I found this in my husband's things after he passed." She handed Ethan the envelope, and he opened it to find several documents inside. The first was a letter from Margaret's late husband, detailing his own battle with the HOA. He had tried to appeal a series of fines, only to discover that the HOA had altered records to make it look like he had missed payments. When he threatened to go public, Neil had retaliated by issuing more fines and eventually placing a lien on their home. The second document was even more damning: a receipt for a payment Margaret's husband had made, stamped with the HOA's logo. It was proof that Neil had lied about the unpaid dues. Ethan's heart pounded as he looked at Margaret. "This is huge," he said. "If we can prove he's been falsifying records, we can take him down." Margaret shook her head. "It's not that simple," she said. "Neil knows how to cover his tracks. Even with this, you'll need more evidence to make a case. And I don't have the resources to fight him. I just thought maybe it could help you." Ethan thanked her and promised to keep her involvement a secret. As she left, he felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. This wasn't just about his own battle anymore. Margaret's story showed that Neil's corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. If he could expose it, he might not only save his own home, but also bring justice to others who had been victimized. That evening, Ethan decided to escalate his efforts. He reached out to Amanda Grant, a local attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. Amanda came highly recommended, and when Ethan explained his situation, she agreed to meet with him the next day. When they sat down in her small but tidy office, Ethan laid out everything he had: the fines, the bylaws, the photos of the debris, and Margaret's documents. Amanda listened intently, taking notes as he spoke. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. "You're in a tough spot," she said. "HOAs have a lot of power, especially in neighborhoods like Ridgehaven, where the bylaws are written to give the board broad authority. But what Neil Bradley is doing goes beyond enforcement. If we can prove that he's falsifying records or using HOA funds for personal gain, we have a case." Ethan nodded. "So what do we do?" "First, we need more evidence," Amanda said. "Margaret's documents are a good start, but will need to show a pattern of misconduct. That means talking to other residents, reviewing the HOA's financial records, and finding out who's benefiting from these foreclosures. If Neil is working with real estate investors, there's a paper trail somewhere. Ethan felt a surge of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. Over the next few days, Ethan and Amanda began their investigation. Amanda filed a formal request for the HOA's financial records, citing transparency laws that required the board to provide access to residents. At the same time, Ethan started talking to his neighbors, hoping to find others who had been targeted by Neil. Most were hesitant to speak, but a few opened up after hearing about Margaret's story. A retired teacher named Bill admitted that he had almost lost his home over a $200 fine for an overgrown hedge. Another neighbor, a young couple, revealed that they had been forced to sell their house after the HOA raised their dues without explanation. The more Ethan learned, the clearer the picture became. Neil wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was exploiting them for personal gain. Amanda's research uncovered a connection between Neil and a local real estate company, Ridgeview Holdings, that had purchased several foreclosed properties in Ridgehaven at suspiciously low prices. The company's owner, a man named Gerald Kane, was a longtime associate of Neil's. As the evidence mounted, Ethan began to feel the weight of the battle ahead. Neil wasn't going to go down without a fight, and Ethan knew he was taking a risk by challenging him. But he also knew he couldn't back down. Neil's corruption had already ruined too many lives, and Ethan was determined to stop him. One night, as Ethan was reviewing the HOA bylaws for the 100th time, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a plain envelope on the doorstep. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message: "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the note. It was a clear threat, and it confirmed what he already knew: Neil was watching him. But instead of scaring him off, the note only steeled his resolve. Neil could threaten him all he wanted, but Ethan wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. Ethan woke up the morning after receiving the threatening note with a growing sense of determination. The intimidation only confirmed what he had suspected. Neil Bradley was running scared. Still, the situation had become more dangerous, and Ethan couldn't afford to be careless. He decided to install security cameras around his property, covering the driveway, the front door, and the backyard. It wasn't just about protecting his home, it was about gathering evidence if Neil or his associates tried anything else. As he mounted the cameras, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting the black SUV to appear again. Amanda Grant had been hard at work behind the scenes, following up on the request for the HOA's financial records. Predictably, the Ridgehaven HOA delayed providing the documents, citing administrative backlogs. Amanda reassured Ethan that this was a common tactic used by HOAs trying to hide something. "They're stalling," she said during one of their calls, "but they can only drag their feet for so long. If they don't comply, we'll take it to court." Meanwhile, Ethan continued to speak with neighbors, hoping to build a coalition of residents willing to stand up to Neil. He discovered that Margaret's story wasn't unique. There were at least half a dozen families who had faced foreclosure or crippling fines under suspicious circumstances. Some of the stories were eerily similar: small infractions blown out of proportion, escalating fines, and relentless harassment until the homeowners either paid up or sold their properties. One neighbor, an older man named Frank, admitted that he had paid over $10,000 in fines over the past 5 years. "They get you little by little," Frank said bitterly. "By the time you realize what's happening, you're already drowning." Despite these conversations, most of the residents were reluctant to take any direct action. "Neil keeps tabs on everyone," one neighbor warned Ethan. "If he finds out we're talking to you, he'll come after us next." Ethan understood their fear, but it frustrated him. Neil's power depended on people's silence, and as long as they stayed quiet, he would continue to exploit them. The pressure from the HOA escalated quickly. A week after the note, Ethan received another letter, this time accusing him of violating HOA landscaping regulations. According to the notice, the flowers planted in his front yard were not on the approved species list. The letter included a new fine of $750 and a deadline for removing the plants. Ethan couldn't believe it. He hadn't even planted the flowers. They had been there when he moved in. Furious, he called Amanda, who immediately saw through the tactic. "They're trying to overwhelm you," she said. "The more they pile on, the harder it is for you to fight back." Ethan's resolve was tested further when the HOA began targeting Lily. One afternoon, she came home from school visibly upset. "Dad, someone at school said their parents told them we're troublemakers," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are they saying that about us?" Ethan clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. Neil's reach extended even into his daughter's life, and it was becoming clear that nothing was off limits. He tried to reassure Lily, telling her not to worry about what other people said, but the damage was done. The harassment was no longer just about him, it was affecting his family. That evening, Ethan decided to take a risk. He knew Neil's power came from the HOA bylaws and the fear he instilled in the community, but if Ethan could uncover concrete evidence of corruption, he might be able to turn the tide. Amanda had mentioned the possibility of financial misconduct, and Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's story about the secret archives in the HOA office. If those archives existed, they might contain the proof he needed. After discussing it with Amanda, Ethan came up with a plan. She would continue pursuing the financial records through legal channels, while Ethan took a more direct approach. Late one night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and his phone, Ethan drove to the HOA office. The building was dark and quiet, and he parked a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. As he approached the back door, he noticed a keypad lock. Luckily, Margaret had mentioned the code. Neil rarely changed it, assuming no one would dare to defy him. The door clicked open, and Ethan slipped inside. His heart pounded as he crept through the narrow hallway, searching for anything that resembled an archive or storage room. The office was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, he found a locked filing cabinet labeled Compliance Records. Using a small toolkit Amanda had lent him, Ethan managed to pick the lock. Inside were dozens of folders, each containing detailed records of fines, foreclosures, and property sales. Ethan flipped through the files, his hands shaking. The patterns were undeniable. Fines were issued disproportionately to certain residents, particularly those who had clashed with Neil. In many cases, the fines escalated rapidly, leading to liens and eventual foreclosures. What stood out most, however, were the sale records. Nearly every foreclosed property had been sold to Ridgeview Holdings, the real estate company Amanda had identified. The prices were far below market value, suggesting a coordinated effort to strip residents of their homes and profit from their losses. Ethan snapped photos of the most incriminating documents, knowing he didn't have time to copy everything. As he worked, he heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the parking lot. Panic surged through him, and he quickly shut the cabinet and slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows. As he walked back to his car, he saw the black SUV parked outside the office, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Whoever was inside didn't see him, but it was clear he had come dangerously close to being caught. The next day, Ethan shared the photos with Amanda, who was stunned by the evidence. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "If we can link Neil directly to Ridgeview Holdings, we'll have a case for fraud. But you need to be careful, Ethan. If Neil finds out you've been in that office, he'll come after you harder than ever." Amanda's warning proved prophetic. Within days, the harassment escalated again. Ethan woke up one morning to find graffiti scrawled across his garage door. The message was chilling: "Stay in line, or you'll lose everything." Lily found it before he did, and the look on her face broke his heart. She was scared, and Ethan knew he couldn't let this go on much longer. Neil had crossed a line, and it was time to fight back. Ethan and Amanda began preparing their case, building a timeline of Neil's misconduct and gathering testimony from neighbors who were finally starting to speak out. Margaret agreed to come forward, along with Frank and a few others who had suffered under Neil's regime. Amanda also subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, knowing they would contain even more evidence of fraud. As the pieces came together, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Neil's empire was starting to crumble, and for the first time, Ethan believed he might actually win. But the battle wasn't over yet, and he knew Neil wouldn't go down without a fight. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as Ethan Harris took his seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Neil Bradley sat with his attorney, his usual smug confidence replaced by a cold, steely expression. The stakes had never been higher. Over the past few weeks, Amanda Grant had worked tirelessly to prepare their case, assembling a mountain of evidence that painted a damning picture of Neil's corrupt rule over the Ridgehaven HOA. Now, it all came down to a public hearing that could finally expose Neil's web of deceit, or leave Ethan to face the consequences of defying him. Ethan's heart pounded as the judge entered the courtroom, calling the session to order. Amanda stood, her calm, measured voice filling the room as she began her opening statement. Your Honor, this case is about abuse of power and corruption at the highest levels of the Ridgehaven HOA. The defendant, Neil Bradley, has used his position as HOA president to extort money from residents, falsify records, and profit from a systematic scheme of foreclosures. Today, we will show evidence that demonstrates not only his misconduct, but also the broader network of fraud that he has orchestrated. Amanda's confidence was reassuring, but Ethan couldn't help feeling a flicker of doubt as Neil's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Hollis, rose to deliver his response. Hollis painted a very different picture, portraying Neil as a dedicated community leader who was merely enforcing the rules to maintain Ridgehaven's high standards. The accusations against my client are baseless, Hollis said smoothly. This is nothing more than an attempt by a disgruntled resident to undermine the integrity of our neighborhood. The first part of the hearing focused on Ethan's experience. Amanda called him to the stand, and he recounted the events of the past few months, the absurd fines, the pile of debris, the graffiti on his garage. As he spoke, Amanda presented the photos and documents Ethan had collected, including the HOA notices and the threatening note he had received. Ethan felt a wave of vindication as the judge examined the evidence, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. Next, Amanda introduced the financial records she had obtained after weeks of persistence. These records revealed a troubling pattern. Fines and liens disproportionately targeted certain residents, and nearly all foreclosed properties were sold to Ridgeview Holdings at suspiciously low prices. Amanda's voice was steady but forceful as she connected the dots, laying out how Neil had used the HOA's authority to funnel properties into the hands of his associate, Gerald Kane. The real bombshell came when Amanda called Margaret Sloan to the stand. Margaret, though visibly nervous, spoke with quiet determination about her late husband's battle with the HOA. She described how Neil had manipulated records to make it appear as though they had missed payments, and how he had issued escalating fines until they were forced to sell their home. As Margaret detailed her experience, Amanda presented the receipt Margaret's husband had kept a document that directly contradicted the HOA's claims of unpaid dues. Richard Hollis tried to discredit Margaret, suggesting that her testimony was based on misunderstandings and misplaced grievances. But Amanda was prepared. She presented additional receipts and emails that showed Neil's pattern of falsifying records, leaving Hollis visibly rattled. The final piece of evidence was the most damning. Amanda revealed the photos Ethan had taken during his late-night visit to the HOA office, showing the contents of the compliance records file cabinet. The photos included detailed logs of fines, foreclosure proceedings, and property sales, all of which showed a clear pattern of targeting vulnerable residents. Amanda also introduced emails obtained through a subpoena that linked Neil directly to Ridgeview Holdings. These emails discussed property sales and included references to mutual benefits, strongly implying kickbacks. Neil's composure finally cracked as Amanda presented the emails. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. Hollis objected, arguing that the emails were taken out of context, but the judge overruled him, allowing Amanda to proceed. The courtroom was silent as Amanda delivered her final argument, her voice ringing with conviction. This is not about maintaining community standards, she said. This is about power and greed. Neil Bradley has exploited the trust of this community for his own gain, and it's time to hold him accountable. When it was Neil's turn to testify, his demeanor was markedly different from the confident man Ethan had encountered in the HOA office. Under Amanda's cross-examination, he struggled to explain the discrepancies in the financial records and the emails linking him to Ridgeview Holdings. His attempts to deflect blame only made him look more culpable. By the time he stepped down, it was clear that the judge was unimpressed. The hearing concluded with closing arguments, and the judge announced that he would issue a ruling the following week. As Ethan left the courtroom, He felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They had presented a strong case, but the outcome was still uncertain. Amanda reassured him, saying, "We've done everything we can. Now it's up to the judge." When the ruling finally came, it was everything Ethan had hoped for. The judge found Neil Bradley guilty of gross misconduct and fraud, ordering his immediate removal as HOA president. The Ridgehaven HOA was placed under investigation, and the court mandated a full audit of its finances. Neil was also ordered to pay restitution to the residents he had wronged, including Ethan and Margaret. For the first time in months, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. As he stood outside the courthouse, watching Neil being escorted away by law enforcement, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The battle had been long and exhausting, but justice had finally been served. Ridgehaven would never be the same, but Ethan knew that this was a new beginning for himself, his daughter, and the community. The aftermath of the courtroom victory rippled through Ridgehaven like a thunderclap. News of Neil Bradley's downfall spread quickly, and the once unshakable figure who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist became a pariah. His removal as president, along with the court-ordered investigation, left the HOA in shambles. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to feel like a place where residents could breathe freely, no longer suffocated by the oppressive shadow of Neil's power. Ethan Harris, though relieved by the outcome, found himself grappling with a strange mix of emotions. The fight had taken a toll on his time, his finances, and even his relationship with Lily, who had carried the weight of her own fear and frustration throughout the ordeal. Now, with Neil gone and the fines invalidated, the debris cleared from his driveway, and his garage freshly painted to erase the hateful graffiti, Ethan felt a sense of peace returning. But it wasn't the same as before. The neighborhood had changed, and so had he. Margaret Sloan became something of a local hero. Her courage in coming forward inspired other neighbors to share their own stories, many of which became part of the broader investigation into Ridgeview Holdings and Neil's scheme. Amanda Grant, who had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, continued to represent residents pro bono, ensuring they received fair compensation for the hardships they had endured. Ethan was glad to see the community slowly coming together, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that rebuilding trust would take time. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch sipping coffee, Lily joined him, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She sat beside him, opening the book to reveal a drawing of their house, framed by the tall trees that bordered the yard. "I finished it," she said, her voice quiet but proud. Ethan looked at the drawing and smiled. It was beautiful, full of light and life, just as he had hoped their home would be when they first moved in. "You know," Lily continued, "I hated it here for a while. I hated all the fighting and the way people looked at us. But now, it feels different. Better." Ethan nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It is better. And you were braver than anyone, Lily. I couldn't have done this without you." A few weeks later, the neighborhood held its first HOA meeting since Neil's removal. For the first time, the board was composed of residents who had been elected by the community, not handpicked by Neil. The meeting was held at the community center, and Ethan was surprised by how many people showed up. There was a sense of hope in the air, a collective determination to rebuild Ridgehaven into the welcoming place it had always pretended to be. During the meeting, Margaret Sloan was formally recognized for her bravery, and the new HOA board announced sweeping changes to the bylaws, limiting the authority of the board and ensuring greater transparency. Ethan sat in the back, watching as neighbors spoke openly, voicing their ideas and concerns without fear of retaliation. It was a stark contrast to the tense, superficial gatherings he had witnessed before. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Ethan to thank him for standing up to Neil. One of them, a retired teacher named Bill, said, "You gave us the courage to fight back. If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. It took all of us." As the months passed, Ridgehaven began to feel like the neighborhood Ethan had hoped for when he first moved in. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started coming together, organizing events and sharing stories about their lives. Lily began spending more time outside, drawing and laughing with a group of new friends. For the first time, Ethan felt like they truly belonged. One evening, Ethan decided to host a small gathering at his house. He invited Margaret, Amanda, and a few other neighbors who had been instrumental in the fight against Neil. As they gathered around the backyard fire pit, sharing food and stories, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The house, once a symbol of his struggle, had become a place of joy and connection. As the fire crackled and laughter filled the air, Ethan looked around at the people who had become more than neighbors, they had become friends. Ridgehaven wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but it was no longer a place of fear. It was a home, and Ethan knew that he and Lily were finally where they belonged.